Hello and welcome to an ongoing series where I'm going to be covering every single one of Knuckles' relatives from the very beginning all the way to the far off future. This here is the very first episode of this series. Eventually it will be uploaded as a full 3+ hour long video, but for now just sit back and enjoy these monthly releases.
Knuckles the Echidna might just have the most lore surrounding compared to any other character found within the Archie Sonic comic universe, and that's in no small part due to the fact that he has a family tree of over 60 relatives that we can find throughout the comic books. So today we're going to be taking a look at each and every one of these echidnas in the family tree because clearly I have gone insane. I'm going to tackle each and every one of them just to give a brief overview of them. It isn't a comprehensive deep dive. At some points there are some of them that I do want to do a deep dive on, however. So let's get started. The earliest relatives of Knuckles trace back hundreds of years, starting with Pachikamak and his daughter Tikal. They were part of an echidna expedition that set sail to discover new lands, and they wound up in an area called Cat Country. It's here where they started to wage war against the native inhabitants who, yes, you guessed correctly, are in fact cats. Now, some scientists of this expedition found this war to be pretty bad and they wound up leaving. And so the group that stayed behind, the more warlike group, were named the Knuckles clan because I guess they liked punching things. Pachikamak, the leader of the Knuckles clan, harbored a good deal of resentment towards the scientists who left, but he continued to wage war against the native inhabitants here, and it led to the discovery of the Mystic Ruins and a shrine found within. Now, in this shrine, there were 7 Chow, 7 Chaos Emeralds, as well as Chaos. Chaos, as we remember from Sonic Adventure, is the god of destruction, and Pachikamak sought to use the power of the Chaos Emeralds to fight the cat people. But Chaos was not super into that, and so he and his Chow refused to do that, and they attacked the Echidna people. Ultimately, the Knuckles clan would hold their ground until Pachikamak and his people were completely wiped out by Chaos. And that's kind of it for them. So let's take a little look at Tikal. Now, Tikal, despite being the leader of the Knuckles clan, she was actually a total pacifist. And we would learn that she got this through her grandmother's footsteps that she followed. Tikal was pretty young during the Knuckles clan war, and she'd be among some of the first to go and explore the shrine where Chaos resided. Now, this shrine would actually be a Chow garden, and in line with her beliefs, Tikal wasn't there for war purposes. And so she wound up being welcomed really well by these creepy little Chow who lived there, and she befriended Chaos. Now, these Chow were actually known as the 7 Servants, and not long after befriending everyone, that's when her father, Pachikamak, would show up, and he would want to use the Chow Garden to power his war. And this would, understandably, anger Chaos, and he would go on a rampage against the Knuckles clan as he turned the 7 Servants into his 7 Super Emeralds, which allowed him to go all perfect chaos. The Knuckles clan would be destroyed, and I guess not Tikal. We'll talk about that later. But ultimately, Tikal and Chaos would end up being sealed away inside of another emerald that Eggman would break open into the future. Once released, Tikal would be in spirit form and she would help Knuckles and aid him and his friends to defeat Chaos, which ultimately just involved throwing a bunch of Chaos Emeralds at them, allowing them to all go super and take on Chaos. Now, after an unknown amount of time, the Knuckles clan would do something of note again, and this time it would be in the form of Knuckles' great grandparents. That being Jordan and Kaylala. Now, since the destruction of the Knuckles clan, the Echidna people had actually set up shop in a new area, and they found an era of prosperity. And they really found this golden era for themselves. So the Echidna people essentially had the most advanced city, which was Echidnopolis, and they found a huge amount of success in technological advancements. Now, here in Echidnopolis, Jordan and his wife, Kaylala, would work together as scientists and live together as a married couple. These 2 scientists would discover some dire news, however, and that was that there was a white comet on direct route with the Echidna city of Echidnopolis. Fortunately, though, Kaylala had a plan, and she presented it in front of her peers and other echidnas in the Hall of Learning. Essentially, her plan was to launch Echidnopolis into the sky by using the experimental power of the Chaos Emeralds found around the island. Now, not all the echidnas were super into the idea of using experimental power to send them flying into the sky, and so they decided to leave Echidnopolis, which honestly is a pretty valid idea. Fortunately, though, for the echidnas who stayed behind, Echidnopolis was built on an island surrounded by a river, and through a sheer miracle, the island was connected through a very small section of land, which made it really easy to break off after the echidnas had mined a bunch of Chaos Emeralds and used it to send themselves rocketing into the sky right in the nick of time. So Echidnopolis would then become the floating island that we knew from the video games. Also, as Echidnopolis flew into the sky, there would also be a bunch of fire ants who would just come out of the ground. It makes me feel really uncomfortable, and I guess they've just been living underneath Echidnopolis for this whole time. Now, it's a tough act to follow when your parents saved your people from total annihilation, and so for that reason, the next 3 generations didn't really get up to all that much, and they exist only in name. However, because they do have names and because they were found within the comics, I'm going to talk about them really quick. Now, my friend Bean is actually drawing all of these echidnas for me, and I had you guys give suggestions as to what these echidnas should look like. So the ones that aren't seen in the comics might look a little bit goofy. I'll put them as well as the name of the person who suggested them. Who knows, maybe you'll see an echidna that you suggested. Anyways, first up is Knuckles' 17th great grandfather and the son of Jordan and Kilala, which was Spencer. Now, Spencer would go on to marry Rosa Lynn, and the two of them would end up having Jeffrey. Jeffrey would meet Diana, and the two of them would have Byron. Byron would meet Angela, and then Byron and Angela would have 2 children, that being Edmund and Dmitri. Now, it's here where things would pick up yet again. Now, before we get into Edmund and Dmitri, I want to do something a little bit different. Typically, at the end of my videos, I like to talk about fun facts, little thoughts I had, things like that. However, due to the sheer scope of this video, it would just be far too cumbersome at the end of the video to have all kinds of fun facts about characters that likely you would have forgotten by the time you got there. So what I've decided to do instead is, at specific segments, incorporate a little intermission where I would talk about characters and events that we had seen up to date, as well as some of my own thoughts and theories I had. These are going to be intermissions, and welcome to our first intermission segment. Now, also during this time, we're going to get to see some amazing art that Bean has done. I really want to thank them for all of that. It's very, very goofy. I appreciate everybody's suggestions that they give, as these visual aids really help in identifying a lot of characters that we've talked about. All right, let's get into some fun facts. So, an amusing twist that you may have noticed, Knuckles is not named due to the fact that he has giant pointy knuckles, but rather named after an ancient clan. Truth be told, I don't know which version of this that I like. I think both of them are pretty lazy ways to name someone. Now, talking about the Knuckles clan, of course, we got to talk about Tikal. And what I find kind of weird is that we know that somewhere inside of the Knuckles clan, Knuckles is related to someone presumably Tikal or Pachikamak. However, I find it kind of hard to figure out how he's related, as almost all of them got wiped out, and we never saw Tikal go on to have any kind of significant partners or anything like that. My theory here is essentially that maybe Tikal wasn't initially locked away and she got to meet someone who she settled down with, or maybe in a scenario like Anakin, she was some kind of just force power that impregnated an echidna. I don't know. Somehow Knuckles is related to them, though. I don't think the writers really thought that hard about it.
Hey, this is Future Editing Sam here, and I don't know why I was so fixated on the idea that Knuckles had to be directly related to Tikal or Pachikamak. It's not possible at all, considering that Tikal was locked away inside of that emerald, so scratch that. I'm pretty sure that it's later specified that Knuckles was actually related to the scientist Splinter Cell that broke off. However, I couldn't find the issue where they mentioned that. If somebody could point it out to me, that would be awesome. But ultimately, yeah, I'm pretty sure that he's from the faction that split off, because it seems like the entire Knuckles clan was killed off by the whole Chaos incident.
Additionally, though, when it comes to relatives, we should talk a little bit about Knuckles' family in a bit of a different area. So we would find out inside of the Archie Sonic Encyclopedia that the scientist gang that left the Knuckles clan actually would form the Nocturnus clan, which we would know from the Sonic the Dark Brotherhood video game. Now, the Nocturnus clan only have a really minor role in the Archie comics, and they actually only show up in an alternate universe, and this would, of course, lead to the Kempenders lawsuit, so they're not really here. However, because the encyclopedia does mention this, I think it's fair to assume that Knuckles is related to somebody on the Nocturnus clan. And I have a little bit of a headcanon here, which is that Tikal's grandmother, as well as Tikal's mother, were likely part of that scientist side, and that's why we never saw them. Maybe one of the reasons that Pachikamak is so angry is that his wife and his mother-in-law ended up leaving him with the scientist to go and found the Nocturnus clan. Honestly, just a theory. I think that one actually stands up pretty well compared to a lot of my theories that I'm going to have in this video, but that's really what I think there. So somewhere way down the line, Knuckles is super distantly probably related to somebody in the Nocturnus clan. However, they're not seen inside of the main universe of the Archie comics, so it's a little bit redundant. Now, before we move on to things that happened after the ancient history, we're going to talk a little bit more about Tikal. Tikal had a few little errors early on with her character. So when she was first introduced in Sonic the Hedgehog number 82, her name was spelled correctly. However, her design was way off. It didn't match her game design at all, and I just assumed that they didn't have specifics from Sega at the moment. Now, in the very next issue, it seems as though they got the references they needed, and so she looks very game accurate. However, they spelled her name Tical instead of Tikal, and I find it kind of funny because of all the names. Why would Tikal be the one they struggled with? Personally, while writing the script, I had a really hard time with Pachikamak. I really had to double check pretty frequently to make sure I was writing it correctly. However, they got his name right every time. Now, moving on from the ancient history, let's talk a little bit about Jordan and Kayla Law's children. So more specifically, I want to talk about Angel Law. She's really one of the only ones who has done anything of note, and even then, it's really just in name. So what's kind of interesting is that much later into the comic books, we would find out that her name was adopted by the Echidna people when they were renaming the floating island to be Angel Island. It's a neat touch. However, it seems kind of unwarranted to her character because, like I said, she doesn't do anything really that we see. She shows up more or less just in name. Also, kind of interestingly, similarly with Tikal, the naming was occasionally a little bit off. More specifically, one of the first times that she was referenced as not Angel Law, but rather Kara Lynn in a text block. And what's even funnier to me is that Kayla Law was also accidentally called Prab Joe in the Sonic Encyclopedia. I have no idea where that name came from. I can't find anything everywhere, and Prab Joe is just such a weird sounding name. Like, I really want to know where that came from. Now, just for a little bit of fun, let's indulge a bit of a headcanon based on these different names and assume that every name that we see is a real character. So perhaps Kayla Law was overly dedicated to science, which led to Jordan perhaps remarrying to Prab Joe or having a mistress on the side, and that's where Spencer came from, who knows? And while Edmund and Dmitri are brothers, perhaps there's a darker secret behind them. Maybe one of them was a love child between Byron and Kara Lynn. Now, Kara Lynn is introduced on a Dmitri page, which maybe suggests that she is Dmitri's biological mother, whereas Angel Law was more of an adopted mother. Who knows? These are all just really bad theories that I have. Anyways, with that, we're going to return to the family tree video, and it's going to be a little bit till we're back inside of the next intermission zone. Alright, so Edmund and his brother Dmitri would follow in the steps of their great-grandparents as Chaos Emerald scientists. Now, together, the two of them would devise a way to return the floating island to the land below, and that would be by depowering the Chaos Emeralds that allow the island to float. Doing this would involve a Chaos Siphon device that they had created together. However, the Chief Magistrate would find this to be far too risky of a plan, and the request would be denied. This would cause Dmitri to leave in anger with the device that they proposed to use. Edmund and the Chief Magistrate would have to rush not far behind, but it would be too late. Dmitri would end up using the Chaos Siphon device on himself, and the awesome power of the Chaos Emeralds would just be far too much for it to handle. With that, the energy would be absorbed into him, and through the Chaos Force, Enerjack, an evil god, would be released as he took over Dmitri's body. Now, to keep a long story short, Dmitri would end up being crushed underneath a tower that he had created, and Edmund would narrowly escape along with the Chief Magistrate thanks to the help of some fire ants. Dmitri would be presumed dead, and Edmund would have to prepare for an uncertain future where he would take his son Steppenwolf and adopt his nephew Menaker. Now, in response to the damage caused by the siphon device, Echidnopolis would decide to outlaw technology on the floating island, and this ban would range from dangerous weapons as well as just things like video games and VHS players. Surprising to no one, not all of the Echidnas were super on board with this decision to give up all of their electronics, and some citizens would revolt. Some would just be angry, however, some would go really hard in the other direction. Edmund would watch a flying ship crash, and when he went to go investigate the crash site, he would be attacked by some rebels. And while here, Edmund would attempt to fight them off, but it would be no use. He would ultimately be shot dead in the street only for his son to find him, which honestly sounds like the start of a superhero origin story. And behind every superhero is a super mom. Now, unlike Tikal, we would actually get to see Edmund's wife and Steppenwolf's mother, which was Siwa Ra. She was only named inside of the encyclopedia later on, and she's only really seen this one time when she's sitting around watching her husband. However, as we can tell from the scene, she's probably a pretty supportive wife. However, she never says or really does anything, so that's all speculation there. But as we'll soon find, this is more than the majority of the wives will get throughout this video. Her fate after Edmund's death is completely unknown. Maybe she ended up dying, maybe she went into hiding, who knows? Women are just kind of expendable in this. So following Edmund, we would have his son Steppenwolf, and Steppenwolf, as we know, would have watched his father as well as his uncle do their presentation and then run run off with the Chaos Siphon device. Following this, Dmitri would die, and Miniker, Steppenwolf's cousin, would be adopted. We'd have our little time skip where eventually technology would be banned, and Steppenwolf would partake in assisting with collection of all the electronic devices in Echidnopolis. He would even end up taking his cousin's Sega Genesis console, and at least in person, Miniker seemed all too fine with this referendum. Now, not to get too repetitive, Steppenwolf would then go on to warn his father that not everybody is happy with this new policy, and he would end up going to follow somebody in an alley. Now, I'm not 100% sure what he thought this person was doing, as he just goes, "But did you ever imagine his kind, father? The kind that sulk in the shadows." And it's just like, you're kind of profiling a dude based on nothing. However, it seems as though Steppenwolf's suspicions would be correct, and he would find a whole gang of hooded beings that worshipped Dmitri and were against this referendum. This would lead to Steppenwolf running off and escaping inside of a flying ship that would ultimately get shot down. Steppenwolf would go and hide from his assailants, and while hidden, his father would show up, and as we know, he would ultimately get shot, only for him to find him in the streets. Now, after finding his father, Steppenwolf would meet Christopheles the Fire Ant, who would come and rescue him. Christopheles would take Steppenwolf under his wing and train him both in physical prowess and mental abilities, because I guess fire ants just have that kind of ability. Now, once the time was right, Christopheles would show Steppenwolf a Chaos Emerald and explain to Steppenwolf that all of his power is channeled through it, and somehow Steppenwolf would just learn to fly thanks to this. Again, just a thing they do. Lastly, Christopheles would lead Steppenwolf to a hidden location behind a cloaking device that I guess the fire ants built. They don't really explain much of that, but this is Haven, and it's essentially going to serve as the headquarters for all of the future Guardians. Now, while Steppenwolf was away training, Echidnopolis fell into a civil war, and they were on the brink of losing, or winning, depending on which side that you're rooting for. Luckily though, for the losing side, Steppenwolf would come back to try and help save the day. Now, this would immediately spark some conflict, as some of them believed that if not for Steppenwolf's family, none of this would be happening, which honestly valid. An echidna by the name of Garrick would pull a gun on Steppenwolf in order to take his life and use him as a bargaining chip with the newly formed Dark Legion, who had gone all in with tech. Steppenwolf would then walk towards him with his arms spread out and tell Garrick to pull the trigger. If he truly believes that is the best thing to do, then he will give up his life. He then mentions that he would give his life for any of the echidnas here, and this ultimately leads to Garrick breaking into tears and going on about how he's not worthy. It's really strange, and also not the only Christ-like imagery we're gonna get throughout this video. Steppenwolf would then head out to go push the message of peace to the Dark Legion. However, while here, an assassin would attempt to fire on Steppenwolf, but suddenly his hands would start to burn. And I assume that's due to Christopheles or some of the fire ants. However, they don't really make it clear here. Maybe Steppenwolf just has magic powers. Anyways, due to this, conflict would come up, and the leader of the Dark Legion would explain that he's here for payback. Steppenwolf would manage to pull this leader's mask off, and gasp, it is Miniker underneath. We would learn that Miniker has been hearing the voice of his father Dmitri, who has been urging his son to just kind of turn towards evil. To this, Steppenwolf would decide that peace is no longer an option, and he would open up a portal using chaos energy that would suck each and every one of the Dark Legion members into it. Then, like a cowboy, Steppenwolf would head off into the sunset to continue to fight the good fight. Eventually, during his travels, Steppenwolf would meet a female echidna by the name of Erica, and the two would have a child named Moonwatcher. Steppenwolf would raise his son Moonwatcher with the goal of one day having him take over the family business, which was of course protecting the floating island. One day, some overlanders would show up on the floating island, and we would learn that Eggman's red eyes are in fact genetic, as this man here is Brutus Kintobor, and like Eggman, he has red eyes. While Brutus would say that he was here for peace, the other overlanders would start to whisper about getting ready to shoot to kill, so Steppenwolf would use his overpowered chaos abilities to burn the minds of the overlanders here and force the overlanders off of the island. From here, Steppenwolf would decide that the Guardians should work in tandem. While one of them would protect the island, the other one would go on ground and try to protect the surface layer of Mobius. So he would take a more mature Moonwatcher under his wing, and Moonwatcher would work alongside of his father before eventually having children of his own. Now, Steppenwolf at some point would presumably just pass of old age, but he is seen sitting with his son, grandson, and great-grandson, so he was around for quite a while. He would also be there for Knuckles after Knuckles temporarily passed away. He'd be there as essentially this Chaos Force ghost, and we would learn that essentially you remain a ghost until you're chosen to rejoin the Chaos Force, and the majority of Knuckles' ancestors, strangely, have never been chosen to rejoin this force. It's a little bit strange. Anyways, moving on from Steppenwolf, we've got his wife, which is Erica. Now, Erica doesn't really do much. She's seen next to her husband, and she gives birth to their son. Other than that, we don't really know what happened to Erica at any point throughout the story. Moving on, we then have Knuckles' 12th great-grandfather, which was Moonwatcher. Now, like we know, Moonwatcher, during his teens and early adult stage, would be brought into the family business, and after some time, he would have a son named Harland, who would also join up with the Guardians. Now, aside from that, Moonwatcher doesn't really do much of anything of note. We can assume that he also died of old age, and his Chaos Force ghost is also seen after Knuckles died. Now, while we don't see much of Moonwatcher, we do know through the encyclopedia that he wound up having a wife, and that was Luna Ray, and together the two of them would have Harland. Now, if you're yearning for a deep story about Harland, get ready to be disappointed. Here's like one of two images that exist of him. He's kind of neat looking, but Harland would eventually just go on to serve as guardian and have a son named Rembrandt. That's kind of it. Also, we can see Harland as a ghost. Now, we saw basically nothing about Harland, so it would make sense that we'd see nothing about his wife. Harland off-panel would end up meeting someone by the name of Donna, and like I said, the two of them would have Harland. I'm really glad that Bean is drawing some characters here because, as you can start to tell, a lot of them don't actually have any official art associated with them. Now, moving on, we have Harland's son Rembrandt, and Rembrandt sure was a guardian. Look at him sitting there. Now, to be fair, Rembrandt would play a slightly larger role here. Rembrandt would have two boys, that being Aaron and Jordan, and unfortunately, Aaron would pass in a fight against some Overlanders and the Dark Legion who had returned. Now, Rembrandt would then go on to train his younger son Jordan to be the next guardian. And even at this point, Steppenwolf would chime in, reminding us that he is in fact still alive, and that, hey, maybe the initial idea of working in tandem with a child isn't that great of an idea, and it should be a more gradual thing where the child isn't sent to, go and fight Overlanders and die. Now, of course, it takes two to tango, and so Rembrandt wound up tangling off screen at least twice with his wife, which was Sassy Ka. And say it with me, she's only given a name thanks to the encyclopedia. Now, starting with Rembrandt's older son Aaron. Aaron, on his third time exploring Mobius, would come across some Overlanders talking with the Dark Legion. Aaron would then run for his life as he was still a child and was in no way equipped to deal with them. However, he would learn that these Overlanders in Dark Legion were setting up a missile to attack the floating island. Then, as some kind of Star Wars twist, we would learn that, like Palpatine, somehow Menneker had returned and he was leading the Dark Legion once again. Aaron would jump onto the missile and Menneker wouldn't be far behind. In an act of heroism, Aaron would opt to detonate the missile in the air, killing both himself and Menneker in the process. This, of course, would be heartbreaking to the Guardians, as this was their first loss since Edmund, and I actually can't find his ghost anywhere in the crowd after Knuckles died, so maybe he was one of them that made it into the Chaos Force thanks to his noble acts. Now, following Aaron's funeral, Jordan would ask his father to become a guardian, and his ghost is seen at Knuckles' funeral, so I guess he died at some point off-panel. Speaking of off-panel things that Jordan got up to, Jordan also met up with Condi, who would end up being his wife, and the two of them would give birth to Matthias. Now, in an interesting change of pace, we actually don't know a ton about Matthias's past. We know that at some point he'd have a kid named Hawking, and that's kind of it. Now, despite being crazy old, Matthias would actually live long enough to meet with Knuckles, and you've got to keep in mind that Matthias was 8 generations older than Knuckles, so that makes him like absolutely ancient here. The dude's a relic. Now, Matthias would explain to a bunch of other relatives that we're going to get to shortly that he has been in a more or less permanent meditation but was pulled out of it due to a disturbance when he learned that the Dark Legion planned to start Armageddon. So the gang would have to head out to go and stop him. Now, Matthias was pretty powerful. He had all kinds of powers thanks to his Chaos Force abilities, such as the ability to teleport his relatives, and he also managed to flip a tank with his mind. However, ultimately, he would die off-panel during this assault. As a matter of fact, we only know that he died because Spectre here, another relative that we're going to get to soon, would inform Knuckles of it. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't show up as a ghost at Knuckles' funeral. I couldn't find him here. Maybe, thanks to all of his meditation, he managed to join the Chaos Force. I don't know. Now, like most wives, we never really saw her, but Matthias did have a wife that would be introduced in the encyclopedia. This was Jaina. Nothing is really known about Jaina, however, just due to her name, I like to think that she's the Echidna version of Jaina Proudmoore from Warcraft. However, unlike Jaina from Warcraft, this Jaina only exists to give birth to a son and then disappear into nothingness. Now, before we continue, let's take a slight little pause here, take an intermission, and catch our breaths. This also gives me a spot to talk about some of the characters that we covered here, as we've actually talked about 40 characters, making us about 1/3 third of the way through the family tree, and so there's a few things that I want to talk about before we forget about these characters. The first, as you've probably realized, is that every character from Erika to Condi did not serve any purpose. All 10 characters show up and basically do nothing but add some fluff to the Knuckles lore, and really, like I said, they don't contribute to the story in any meaningful way. In fact, the majority of them are all just introduced in Knuckles the Echidna number 25, and then they never show up again until Knuckles ultimately died. So I need to ask a question here, and I want you guys to try to think really hard about this. Were these characters ever even important? Like, honestly, they're really forgettable. I'm doing this intermission right now because I'm pretty sure you're going to forget who these characters are pretty shortly, if not already. So, aside from just making it seem like Knuckles has a really big family tree, why do they exist? If they don't serve to move the plot forward, if they don't serve to be actual characters, why learn about them? A big part of this actually reminds me of when I was a kid and I would read the Bible at school. I went to a Catholic school, and sometimes you would read the Bible and you would find a character introduced in a story, and for whatever reason they would tell you who their father and grandfather were, even though they weren't relevant to the story at all, which honestly is how I feel when reading a lot of Knuckles. Speaking of the Bible, I also have a theory that Ken Penders, the creator of pretty much all of the Knuckles family tree members, really liked incorporating Christ-like characters into his stories about these echidnas. It isn't a video about Knuckles, and we haven't quite gotten to this point yet, but Knuckles does walk on water and lead people to the promised land, so the guy's either Christ-like or Joseph Smith-like. Now, of course, Steppenwolf was also very Messiah-like, but did you know that the name Christopheles, the name of the ant that raised Steppenwolf, means bearer of Christ, which honestly is kind of wild to me if that was just a coincidence. It feels way too purposeful. Matthias is also a biblical name, which means gift of God. More fun with names, of course, would be Brutus Kintobor, who shares the name with Brutus that helped assassinate Caesar. And we can find a little bit of parallels with Brutus getting ready to assassinate Steppenwolf. Penders is also very clearly a Star Trek fan. We've seen in other videos, like inside of the Sonic Live special that I had covered, where they mention a made-up version of Star Trek. Here we'd also get some Star Trek references, the first being Moonwatcher, whose outfit clearly looks like a striking resemblance of Geordi LaForge from Next Gen, down to the visor that he wears, which honestly, kind of fun. I enjoy these little goofy gags here and there. But another more obscure one would be Garrick, the echidna that stood up against Steppenwolf. Now, Garrick shares a similar name to Garrick from Deep Space Nine. So Garrick in the Knuckles comic book is spelled G-A-R-E-K. Garrick in Deep Space Nine is G-A-R-A-K. So maybe it's a coincidence here. However, it's just weird that he's like a named character and just so happens to have a Star Trek name to him. Speaking of name references, of course, there's also Rembrandt, who is probably a reference to the Dutch painter from the 1500s of the same name. However, the guy shares like zero similarities with him aside from name, so I'm not totally sure why they did this. Like, they could have at least maybe, I don't know, given him hair like the guy. Like, look at Ludwig von Koopa, for example. That guy's one of the Koopalings, and you can tell that the guy is related to Beethoven in some way. But Ludwig von Koopa, Rembrandt is not. One last thing that I want to mention here, now that we've talked about so much of Knuckles' family, is that you may have noticed a trend here. Knuckles' family predominantly gives birth to boys, and that is something that we're going to continue seeing throughout the entirety of this exploration. So I kind of have a theory that I have about this, but it's a little bit out there. Now, before I can get into that, I need to talk about Echidna naming convention. As you've noticed, the women here all have names that end with suffixes. The women all have, on average, for the most part, have 2-letter suffixes at the end of their names, with the exception of Rosa Lynn, which has 3. Now, I can't find any proof backing this up, but I'm like 99% sure that Ken Penders, the writer responsible for these names, based the naming conventions on Superman's family, but just gender bent it. See, in Superman, Kryptonians are all given 2-letter suffixes to denote their house name, so Superman is Kal-El, his father is Jor-El, that's just an example there. And I'm pretty sure that Penders wanted to make a similar thing, with Jordan being an homage to Jor-El, because in his first appearance, Jordan is named Jor-Dan, with a whopping 4-letter suffix at the end of his name. Now, this was really early in the creation of the Knuckles family tree, and I think it was done before he had decided that only women should have suffixes, so it was changed going forwards to just Jordan without a dash in it. But to get really headcanon-y, my theory is that Jordan was born Jor-Dan and used the power of the Chaos Emeralds he studied to transition into a man, and the lingering effects caused his lineage to have a predisposition to giving birth to male echidnas. It's clear that the floating island idea was his wife's, and so he had to be doing something in the background while studying those Chaos Emeralds, so why not that? But that's just a theory. A really out there and wild, baseless theory. Back to the Knuckles family.
Or at least I would be back to the Knuckles family if not for the fact that this first part is over. And I want to thank you so much for watching it this far along if you did. This is, of course, a massive project, and throughout the next couple months, I'm going to be releasing part by part of it. And once it's all out, we're going to do that full 3-hour long video the way that I intended it to be from the start. Anyways, I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts, any comments, things you'd like to add on, please let them be known in the comments below. If you liked it, give it a like. If you really liked it, give it a subscribe. That always helps a ton. But at the end of the day, I'm not your boss. I just hope that you had a good one.